Now we come to the three paradigms of international political economy, which you could also say are the three main theories of international political economy. And before we discuss theory, it's always worth asking the questions, why theory in the first place? Or, as many might ask, can't we just learn the facts? And the answer to the latter question, of course, is no, we cannot just learn the facts. And this is so for a number of reasons. First, facts simply do not exist before theory. For example, I could easily count the number of students whose first name begins with an A in this class. And after I counted it, it becomes a fact that we could learn and discuss about. But I would only start counting if beforehand I would have some kind of theory that makes me believe that this is a relevant number and that it's worth my time counting the students at all. And the same is of course true for numbers I mentioned earlier, for the decline in the amount of global trade or for the decline in the global GDP. These numbers are aggregated with a great amount of effort, and these institutions that measure these numbers only do this because they had some theories making them believe that these numbers are relevant. So we first need theory, and then we can create facts, so to speak. Secondly, we have to select facts. Facts are abundant. There are so many facts out there, we cannot learn them all, and we can only learn a very, very tiny fraction of them. And in order to determine which kind of fraction we should learn and we should pay attention to, we need theory to guide our process of learning facts. Third, facts without theory are meaningless. Facts only obtain meaning after we interpret them, and we can only interpret them if we have some theoretical context that make us see sense in these facts or make sense from these facts. So for all these things we need theory. But then after we have learned certain things from certain facts, thanks to theory, theory can even help us do more with these facts. For example, facts typically only affect the past and not the future. So what happens in the future is hardly ever a fact. That's something that might happen. Facts are only there of stuff that has already happened. Yet, in the sciences, we sometimes want to know what will happen in the future. For example, we want to know how much of a decline in the global GDP do we have to expect. And this we cannot know from facts, but this we can know from good theories about the development of the global GDP and the facts that we know. So for these kind of predictions, we need theory. And finally, we can also turn to theory in order to obtain not only predictions, but also prescriptions. So this is the question, what should happen? And facts never tell us what should happen. It's only after we interpreted the facts by theory and that we have certain normative positions that we can say, well, the states should act in this way, or the labor unions should act in that way. And these kind of prescriptive claims can only take place if we have a good theory. So we need theory to generate, to select and to interpret facts. We need theory to make predictions, and we need theory if we want to make prescriptions. Before I explain these three paradigms, I have to give a little disclaimer or explanation. Ever since people have started talking about these three paradigms as the structure of our academic field, there has been criticisms of this categorization. And critics argue that this categorization is simplistic, that it's wrong and that it's misleading. And for example, that the three paradigms that are distinguished here are in themselves heterogeneous, or that there are other approaches that do not quite fit into any of these paradigms. And all of this is true. However, if we want to understand the field of international political economy, it's helpful to first start distinguishing these three main paradigms And after that, we can go ahead and differentiate. We can start saying, okay, well, there are subdivisions within this paradigm, or that there are approaches that combine knowledge from more than one paradigm, and so on. But first, it helps to distinguish those three paradigms, because that way you can learn about certain ways to look at international political economy. These three main paradigms are economic nationalism, economic liberalism, and critical theories. Economic nationalism is centered around the idea that states are the most important actors in international political economy. So if we look at international political economy, we look at stuff states do. And what do these states do? They struggle for power and wealth in an open competition. So every state tries to maximize its power and its wealth relative to the other states. And these states do so in international anarchy, which means they can never call the world police, and they always have to fight for themselves, and they cannot rely on any other instance. Of course, there are a lot of variants of this economic nationalism. The origin of this is mercantilism, which is the main economic doctrine of European absolutism. And the main idea there was that a good economy is there to make the state and its prince more powerful. And this will happen if the economy amasses as much gold as possible. And when there comes a war, the prince could, for example, use the gold to buy armies. And what do you do to amass as much gold as possible? You sell stuff that's overall more expensive than the stuff you buy, which then means, and this is very important to the development of European colonialism, you import cheap raw materials, for example, cotton, and then you process it in your own country, and then you export the processed materials, for example, textiles. And there are a lot of shortcomings of this approach, but it is historically important. And the main idea there was that the main point about the economy is making the state powerful, and this part remains alive in all strands of economic nationalism, but it has differentiated itself much more, and hardly anyone thinks it's all about amassing as much gold as possible for the glory of the prince. How do these approaches describe the world? They describe the world in the way that they claim, well, the states are much more relevant than most other theories say. So many other theories say, well, international political economy is about business, it's about non-governmental organizations, it's about classes or whatever. But economic nationalists say, well, no, the state was, is, and will remain more important than all these other guys believe. So what does economic nationalism prescribe? They typically advise states to act prudently and strive for stability. So even though they paint the picture of states living in this dog-eat-dog world where everyone fights everyone, they do not encourage reckless behavior by states, but rather they typically encourage prudent behavior, meaning don't be naive, don't give up too much, but also don't try to get too much, because this will only create chaos, and this is not what we want. What we want is a certain stability. Economic liberalism is a little bit younger than economic nationalism because it emerged in the 18th century as a critique of classic mercantilism. The core idea of economic liberalism is that the central actors of the economy are not the states, but the individuals and businesses. And these individuals and businesses interact on the market as they see best fit to their own economic interests. And if they are allowed to do so, then the magic of the market will take place and it will work. And it will work in a way that production will increase and that scarce resources are allocated in a very desirable way. And there are variants of this theory, and this is very important because they are opponents and oftentimes. On the one hand, we have libertarians and certain neoclassics who will argue that the market is really the best and the market will work the better, the less the state will meddle with the market. On the other hand, you have, for example, Keynesians and certain institutionalists who will say something quite different, because they will say, yes, the market is very good in facilitating production and it's very good in producing wealth and fostering the well-being of millions, but it will only do so if the state creates an environment in which the markets will work, and also if the states intervene whenever the markets get out of balance. And so there are quite different approaches, but they all agree on the central idea that the market is a good thing when it comes to facilitating production and organizing circulation and allocation. And so the way they describe the world, so all economic liberals describe the world in a way that they say, well, markets work, but markets sometimes face disruptions. And if you are a neoclassic or libertarian, you would typically say, well, markets face disruptions when there are misguided state interventions or when there are other external shocks such as a pandemic. If you're a Keynesian, you will say these are possible problems for markets, but more importantly, markets will fail in themselves. So if you just let the market go, it will create its own disruptions and create its own failures, and then the state has to step in to make it work again. And the prescription of these approaches are then that the state should create an institutional framework in a way that the markets will work best. And what this is exactly is quite different for some neoclassics and for some Keynesians, but in this abstract sense, they could probably all agree. Finally, critical theories, they in turn emerged as a critique of economic liberalism, and probably the most prominent critical theory or theories are the Marxist approaches, but there are also many others. And if we take these kind of approaches, we would neither look at states as the central actors or as individuals as the central actors, but we would say we have classes that act. So, for example, we would look at the current capitalist economy as an economic structure in which one class is in the position to exploit and dominate other classes. So it's not the dog-eat-dog world between states that nationalists say. It's not the harmony of the markets that some liberals have, but it's a world where an economic structure creates the opportunity for some people to exploit others. But Marxism is not the only critical theory out there. There are also critical theories that focus more on questions of gender, which will also say, well, there's a structure of domination where some, namely typically male people, can dominate and exploit others, namely female people or others. And you could also look at the coloniality of the world order, saying, well, all this came into place through colonialism, and this keeps on working. And depending on which approach you take, you would say these are Marxisms, feminism, post-colonialisms, or something else you could also say is a critical approach are ecological approaches. And I want you to notice the letter S at the end of most of these words. So there is not one Marxism and one feminism and one post-colonialism, but there are different variants of all of these, and these differences are quite important and can be quite stark. So again, how do critical theories describe the international political economy? They say this is a structure marked by domination and exploitation and enabling domination and exploitation and continuing it all over again. And so we describe how this is happening and how this keeps happening. And if we ask critical theories what they prescribe, to happen, they would say, well, these structures of domination and exploitation should be overcome. And typically critical theories are not as naive to say to those who are dominant and exploiting, well, please stop doing so. Rather, they say, well, those who are dominated and exploited should organize in a way to overcome their domination and exploitation. So let's look at how this perspective would look at different phenomena. How would they look at globalization? Economic nationalists typically say, well, globalization, we know there's a lot of talk about it and it's kind of a thing, but it's not as important as many would believe right now. We see that international trade is getting more, we see that international investment is getting more, but still the states always remain the actors who dictate what's going on, and anyone who says that the states are becoming less and less important, they're just misunderstanding the world. And globalization itself is not something that's happening to states, but rather that certain states are facilitating globalization and making it happen because they think it would help them become more powerful and more wealthy. However, economic nationalists might also warn that the states should not be naive here and should not give up any power to international organizations or other states or to whomever. Economic liberals typically have a very different stance on globalization. They are much more certain that it's actually happening and it is actually a very important process. And what they see in it is something very positive. Typically, they see that market forces are liberated and therefore they are allowed to work more effectively and create an even better allocation of resources, because now market forces are no longer stopped at national borders, which most liberals, particularly neoclassical liberals, would consider a good thing. Finally, critical theorists would say, well, globalization might be a process that is facilitated by certain states, but most of all we should look at it as a class project, because it's not so important to see whether the United States is strengthened or weakened by globalization, but we could rather say that businesses all around the globe are strengthened by globalization, and trade unions, on the other hand, are weakened by globalization, because businesses can always say, well, we put our production somewhere else, so we will relocate our factories to Bangladesh and we can produce our t-shirts more cheaply there. But unions who organize workers in textile industry cannot just say, well, we relocate somewhere else. So businesses are winners and labor is loser of globalization. So you could say this whole thing was a class project. And in a similar vein, you could also discuss globalization as a gendered project, particularly if you look at global care chains. So for example, care workers who do household works or who care for children or care for the elderly typically are females that come from poorer countries to richer countries to do this work there. And this in turn enables women in these richer countries to work on the labor market. And these kind of processes are highly gendered because most of these workers are female, and this has effects on both sides and also has effects for gender relations. So you can also look at these processes. Similarly, you can also look at this as some kind of continuation of the old colonization, or you could look at it as something that has vast ecological impact, because if more people travel around the world, if more goods are transported around the world, this also, of course, has an ecological impact. The second example is the COVID-19 pandemic. We can ask, how could these three paradigms look at the current processes and the current events? Economic nationalists might argue, well, this is a case in point of what we have been always saying. The states are and the states remain relevant. all you liberals have been talking about the state waning away for decades right now, but now we see that everybody's crying for help from the state, and this means that the states are and remain the central actors. Moreover, we can also see that all this globalization thing might have been a bad idea, and it would have been better to keep the production of medical goods in your own country. Economic liberals could argue, for example, that this is an external shock. So they would say, well, the markets were working kind of fine, and now some unforeseeable event happened and disrupted the market. And in this situation of disruption, the markets need help from the state. So the state needs to save certain businesses and maybe do a little public investment to put money into the markets. And then after the crisis is gone, we want to go back to the good old pre-crisis normal of a liberal economy. And those of you who follow German politics might have read the report by the Leopoldina the other week, and the section on economics was basically making this case. They were saying, well, it's good that the state is acting right now, but after that state, please go home and leave the economy alone and also save some money. Critical theories finally could argue that the current crisis reinforces pre-existing structures of domination and exploitation that now become more visible and also more powerful in their effects. If we think of those workers who lost their jobs, be it in India or be it in the United States, they were in a marginalized position beforehand, and now their marginalization becomes even stronger and even more dangerous to their livelihood. But critical theories would not say, well, beforehand things were fine and now they're bad. They would say, well, they were bad all along and now we really see how bad they are. So if we combine what I said before on facts and theories and what I said now on these three approaches, we can see that these three approaches, they wouldn't disagree much on the facts. They wouldn't disagree on the fact that around 20 million in the United States lost their jobs. They wouldn't disagree that maybe 120 million in India lost their jobs. They wouldn't disagree on a decline in global trade or a shrinking global GDP. That's something they would say, yeah, this is happening. However, they would strongly differ in how they would interpret these facts, and also strongly differ in how they would argue what will happen in the future and what political actors should do in reaction to these facts. And this is why we need theory. And after we distinguish the three paradigms, we could go into more detail. I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but here you have some kind of family tree of international political economy. And there are only two things I want to highlight here. First, you can see that all the three approaches are more heterogeneous within, so there is not one economic liberalism, but there are many of them. And second, that there are cross relations between those approaches. So there are authors who combine ideas from liberalism and critical theories.